The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember because I was still in the office, which wasn't unusual for me, and I had just poured cold coffee into a mug I hadn't washed since Friday. The voice on the other end was the state liaison from the Ohio Department of Transportation, and he was talking fast. "We need you in Columbus by 7 tomorrow morning. The federal rep is flying in from D.C., and they're moving the signing to 8 a.m. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my jacket, drove home, packed a bag in 12 minutes, kissed my wife on the forehead while she was half asleep, and was back in my car before midnight. That's who I was. That's who I had always been. My name is David Mercer. I was 51 years old, and for the previous 9 years I had been the Chief Infrastructure Compliance Officer at a regional engineering firm called Crestline Partners. We specialized in public works, bridges, transit systems, water treatment facilities, unglamorous stuff. The kind of work that nobody notices until something breaks. I had built the compliance framework for our largest project from scratch, a $2.7 billion federal infrastructure grant tied to a regional rail expansion across 4 counties in northeastern Ohio. The kind of project that comes along once in a career, maybe twice if you're lucky. We had been in development for 3 years. I'd spent those 3 years doing nothing else. The grant structure was complex in ways that most people at our firm didn't fully understand, and I'd stopped trying to explain it at the executive level about 18 months in. The mechanism that made the whole thing work was something called a Coordinated Disbursement Authorization, or CDA. It was a federal requirement specific to multi-jurisdictional rail grants over a certain threshold. Essentially, it meant that the signing entity had to include a certified compliance officer whose credentials were registered in the federal system, not just present, but actively credentialed and listed on the disbursement authorization form. If that person wasn't in the room at the moment of signing, the authorization wouldn't trigger. The funds wouldn't move. The grant would go into a federal review queue that could take anywhere from 8 months to 2 years to resolve. I had explained this to my CEO, a man named Clifford, 3 times in writing and twice in person. I had put it in the quarterly project brief. I had flagged it in every pre-signing checklist. I had a folder on my desktop that was just CDA documentation, organized by date, going back 2 years. Clifford read the executive summaries. That was it. He was not a bad person. He was a man who had built a successful company by trusting the people around him to handle the details, and that approach had worked well enough for 20 years. The problem was that somewhere along the way, he had started listening more to his son than to his compliance officer. His son had joined the firm about 18 months before the signing. He had an MBA from a school I won't name, a confidence that exceeded his experience, and a particular talent for walking into rooms and making people feel like he had already solved whatever problem they were about to describe. He was 33 years old. He had never worked on a federal project of this scale. He didn't know what a CDA was, and more importantly, he didn't think he needed to know, because in his mind, the signing was a ceremony. The hard work was done. The numbers were agreed upon. All we had to do was show up and sign. In the 3 months before the signing, Clifford's son had gradually taken over the coordination of the signing ceremony itself. Not the compliance work, he had no interest in that, but the logistics, the seating arrangements, the catering, the press release, who got invited, what order people would sign. He had a vision for how the day should look, and he was going to deliver it. What he didn't have was a working knowledge of what would happen if I wasn't in the room. The signing was scheduled for 8 a.m. on a Thursday at the Crestline Partners regional office in Columbus. In attendance, 2 county commissioners, a state transportation director, 4 federal representatives including a deputy administrator from the Federal Transit Administration who had flown in from Washington the night before, and 7 executives from the investment consortium that had co-structured the grant with us. 18 people in total. 18 people whose presence I had helped coordinate over months of scheduling calls. I arrived at the office at 6:40 a.m. I had stopped for coffee on the way because the drive from Cleveland takes about 2.5 hours, and I had left at 4 in the morning. I was tired but steady. I knew this day. I had been preparing for it for 3 years. I set my bag down in my office, pulled up the signing checklist on my laptop, and started going through it one more time. Everything was in order. The CDA packet was printed, signed by the Federal Compliance Registry, and sitting in the folder I had prepared 2 weeks earlier. I had my federal credentials on my badge. I had the disbursement authorization form flagged at the correct signature line, with a small note attached explaining to each signatory exactly what they were signing and in what order. At 7:15, Clifford's son came to my office door. He didn't knock. He stepped in, stood with one hand on the doorframe and said, "We need to talk." I closed my laptop. He told me that my position was being eliminated, effective immediately. The firm was restructuring its compliance function and moving to a third-party model. He said it was a business decision, nothing personal, and that HR would be in touch about my separation package. He said he appreciated everything I had contributed to the firm. He said all of this in the same tone someone uses when they're canceling a subscription service. I sat there for a moment. I'm not sure what expression was on my face. I remember the coffee was still warm in my hand. "You understand this is happening in 40 minutes, I said. "The timing isn't ideal," he said, "but these decisions don't always come at convenient times." "I'm not talking about convenience," I said. "I'm talking about the CDA. The signing cannot proceed without me in the room. My credentials are registered as the authorizing compliance officer in the federal disbursement system. That is not a preference. That is a structural requirement." He smiled at me. It was the particular smile of someone who has already decided they know more than you and is waiting for you to finish so they can move on. "We've reviewed the signing documents," he said. "Everything is in order." "You reviewed the documents," I said slowly. "Did you review the federal CDA framework?" "We have legal counsel who has reviewed everything." "Does your legal counsel have federal compliance credentials registered with the FTA?" He told me that he was sure it would work itself out, that these kinds of requirements were often procedural, and that we had a very competent team who could handle any issues that arose. Then he said that security would walk me out and that I should leave my badge and my laptop on the desk. I put the coffee down. I took off my badge. I put it on the desk next to my laptop. And then I did something that I had not planned to do. I opened my laptop back up, logged into my federal compliance portal, and I printed a single document. It was the CDA verification summary, a 2-page document that showed, in plain language, exactly what the disbursement authorization required and whose credentials were registered to satisfy that requirement. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot. It was 7:28 a.m. I thought about calling my wife. I thought about driving back to Cleveland. I thought about the 3 years I had put into that project, the nights I had missed my daughter's school events, the weekend my mother-in-law passed, and I stayed on a call for an extra 4 hours because the county liaison needed clarification on a funding formula. The Christmas Eve, I spent revising the disbursement timeline because one of the federal representatives had flagged a sequencing issue that nobody else had caught. I thought about all of it. And then I thought about the 18 people who were about to walk into a room and discover that the most important piece of the signing had just been walked out of the building. At 8:14 a.m., my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. She introduced herself as the Deputy Administrator from the Federal Transit Administration. She said she was at the signing and that there appeared to be a discrepancy in the disbursement authorization documentation. She said she had asked for the credentialed compliance officer and had been told that person was no longer with the firm, and she wanted to understand what the firm's plan was for satisfying the CDA requirement. I told her I was in the parking lot. There was a brief pause. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "is there any chance you're available this morning?" I told her I had just been terminated. Another pause. Longer this time. "I see," she said. "Would you be willing to come inside so we can discuss the situation?" I told her I would come inside if invited by the proper parties. She said she would make sure of that. I went back inside at 8:21 a.m. I walked through the lobby, past the receptionist who looked at me like I was a ghost, and into the main conference room where the signing was scheduled to take place. I want to describe that room to you because I think it matters. There were 18 people in there. The federal deputy administrator sat at the center of the table, directly across from where Clifford was sitting. The county commissioners were to her left. The investment consortium executives were arranged along the right side of the table. There were water glasses that hadn't been touched, and a tray of pastries that nobody had eaten. There was a thick silence in the room that had clearly been building for the past 20 minutes. Clifford's son was standing in the corner, near the window, in the way that people stand when they are trying to look like they are still in control of a situation that has clearly gotten away from them. Clifford himself looked like a man who had just been told the foundation of his house was cracked. The deputy administrator introduced me to the room. She said that I was the registered compliance officer for the CDA authorization, and that she had asked me to join the meeting to clarify the disbursement requirements. She said it calmly and professionally, and she did not say a single word about the fact that I had been walked out of the building 30 minutes earlier. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room who understood federal procurement already knew exactly what had happened. I sat down at the table. I took the folded document out of my jacket pocket. I placed it on the table and smoothed it flat. One of the investment consortium executives, a man who had been involved in federal infrastructure deals for 20 years, looked at the document, then looked at me, then looked at Clifford's son in the corner. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The deputy administrator said, "Mr. Mercer, can you walk us through the CDA verification?" I did. I walked them through the entire framework. I explained what the requirement was, why it existed, what it protected, and what the consequence of non-compliance would be for the disbursement timeline. I was precise. I was unemotional. I was thorough in the way that you can only be thorough when you have been living inside a document for 3 years. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the lead consortium executive said quietly, "So to be clear, without Mr. Mercer's credentials, the disbursement authorization doesn't trigger." "That's correct," the deputy administrator said. "And his credentials cannot be transferred to another party on the day of signing. Not without a federal re-registration process that takes a minimum of 90 days. The consortium executive nodded once. He looked at his colleagues. Something passed between them that didn't require words. He picked up his folder, straightened his papers, and said to Clifford, "We're going to need to step out and make some calls." All 7 consortium executives stood up at the same time. I watched them file out of the room. The county commissioners exchanged a look. The state transportation director stared at the ceiling. Clifford sat perfectly still with his hands flat on the table, and I could see from where I was sitting that his jaw was tight. His son had moved from the window to the doorway. He was watching the consortium executives leave with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone who has just understood fully the thing they should have understood 3 months ago. The deputy administrator and I spoke privately in the hallway while the room waited. She told me what she needed. She told me what the federal process looked like for bringing in an independent compliance authority when the internal party was no longer available. She asked me if I would consider serving in that capacity. I told her I had just been terminated. She told me that my termination was a matter between me and my former employer, and that the federal grant authorization was a separate matter entirely, and that if I was willing, she had the authority to designate me as an independent compliance authority for the purpose of completing the signing. I asked her what that would look like in terms of my relationship to Crestline partners going forward. She said it would mean I was not representing them. I would be acting as an independent party, designated by the federal authority to satisfy the CDA requirement. I said I would need to review the terms. She gave me 40 minutes. I called my wife from a small conference room down the hall. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "So they walked you out and now they need you back?" "Essentially," I said. She said, "What do you want to do?" That was always her question. Not what should you do? Not what are you going to do? What do you want to do? I thought about it. I thought about it honestly. I told her that I wanted to see 9 years of work result in something. I told her that the project wasn't Clifford's project or his son's project. It was a public infrastructure project that affected 4 counties and about 200,000 commuters who would eventually ride those trains. I told her that I wasn't doing it for Clifford. I was doing it because the work deserved to be finished correctly. She said, "Then go finish it." At 10:15 a.m., I walked back into the conference room. The consortium executives had returned. The commissioners were still there. The deputy administrator was at the head of the table. I sat down in a different chair than I had occupied before. Not Crestline's chair, just a chair. The signing took 45 minutes. It was orderly and precise and completely undramatic in the way that important things often are when they are done correctly. I walked each party through the CDA verification sequence. I confirmed the credential registration in the federal system. I countersigned the disbursement authorization in the designated compliance officer field. The first disbursement tranche cleared federal processing the following business day. I never went back to my office at Crestline. I arranged for my personal items to be shipped to my house. My badge and laptop were already on the desk where I had left them. In the weeks that followed, I learned through channels I won't specify that the consortium had filed a formal complaint with the firm regarding the events of that morning. I learned that 2 of the county commissioners had expressed concerns to the State Transportation Office about Crestline's project management competency. I learned that Clifford's son had been removed from any further role in the project oversight. I also received a letter from the Federal Transit Administration formally acknowledging my service as an independent compliance authority on the authorization and noting my credentials in the Federal Registry for future engagements. 3 months after the signing, a regional infrastructure consulting firm reached out to me. They had been watching the project. They knew the CDA framework. They knew who had actually shepherded it to completion. They offered me a position as a senior partner. I start next month. My name is on the compliance documentation filed with the federal government. My credentials are in the Federal Registry. My work is in the foundation of a rail system that will move people across 4 counties for the next 50 years. That morning in the parking lot, sitting in my car at 7:28 a.m. with cold coffee and a folded piece of paper in my pocket, I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew the work. And sometimes, knowing the work is enough. I've thought a lot about that parking lot. 7:28 in the morning, engine off, coffee going cold, and 9 years sitting in my chest like something I couldn't quite swallow. What happened that day wasn't complicated, even if it felt that way in the moment. Clifford's son made a decision based on what he thought he knew, which was not the same thing as what he actually knew. That gap between confidence and competence is where most disasters live. I've seen it before. A person climbs high enough that nobody beneath them feels safe correcting them, and eventually they make a call that the facts were never going to support. It's not evil. It's just the particular kind of recklessness that comes from never having been wrong in a way that costs them anything until it does. And on my end, I think about what it took to walk back into that building, not because I had something to prove. I want to be clear about that. I walked back in because the work deserved to be finished correctly, and I was the only person in that parking lot who could do it. That distinction matters to me. There's a version of that morning where I drive home, let the whole thing collapse, and spend the next year feeling righteous about it. I chose not to do that. Not for Clifford, not for his son, not even for my own satisfaction. For the 200,000 people who were eventually going to ride those trains, I think that's what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not a grand gesture, not a speech, just deciding in a quiet parking lot that the right thing is still the right thing even when the people who wronged you are the ones who need you to do it. The intelligence part, the knowing, that only matters if you've done the work to earn it. I spent 3 years inside that CDA framework. I didn't do that to hold it over anyone. I did it because the project required it, and the project was real, and real things deserve real attention. Nobody was going to hand me credit for that. I knew going in that compliance officers don't get speeches made about them. We get acknowledged in footnotes, if we're lucky. That was fine. The knowledge was its own foundation, and when the moment came where it was the only thing standing between a $2.7 billion authorization and a federal review queue, it held. The grit part is harder to talk about. I miss things I can't get back. My daughter's winter concert in 2023. A long weekend I had promised my wife for 2 years, the last few months with my mother-in-law, who passed in October and who I called from a hotel room in Columbus the night before a county liaison meeting because I didn't make it home in time. I don't know how to balance that ledger. I'm not sure it balances, but I know that the people I was doing it for, the ones who would ride those trains, the ones who worked on that project for years alongside me, they deserve someone who showed up all the way. What I hope for anyone who recognizes themselves in the story is that you keep the knowledge sharp and the character intact even when the institution around you stops deserving either one. Because institutions change. Leadership changes, but what you know, and who you are, and whether you kept showing up when it was hard, that stays. My name is in the Federal Compliance Registry. The trains will run. That's enough.